So naturally, one of the questions I get asked most is, how do I start dressing vintage? Good question. I'm gonna tell you. Yep. So I've gone over some of these topics a lot in my other videos, but I wanted to make kind of a succinct video that has it all in one place just for someone that's searching for it. I'm no professional in dressing vintage. A lot of my clothes aren't even technically vintage. They're just modern and made to look old. If you're looking for a very strict guideline on how to dress strictly in vintage clothing, then this probably isn't the video for you. I am more or less going to talk about just the vintage style and the illusion of vintage sometimes, along with actual vintage pieces. And I never want any of this to come across as preachy. I'm not one of those people that are like, modern style sucks. Vintage is the way to go. It's classy and the only way that people should dress. That was a good voice. I think everyone is entitled to whatever style they want. Modern fashion is great. I'm not telling anyone that they should dress from the past. It's whatever makes you happy. Yep. I've only dressed this way for about 5 years, but I will share some knowledge from my own personal experiences and what has helped me in making the transition from modern to vintage. So, I wrote some notes. So I'm going to structure this video in a way that makes sense in my own brain by kind of breaking down the parts of the body, kind of like in my dressing vintage in winter video. Just kidding, it's over here. I'll learn that someday. Okay, so starting off. To go to the extreme, I'm going to assume that we're starting off completely modern, but you may have seen vintage style in either the media or on social media. It sparked your interest a bit. So how do you go from completely modern to making that transition, or just trying it out? What becomes daunting about vintage style is that it can seem a little overwhelming at first, especially when you're using social media as your example. Obviously, social media is rose-tinted glasses and everyone puts their best outfits forward and all that jazz. But I think it's important to remember that everyone started somewhere and you can too. Okay. Wow. Snack break. So let's take modern Rachel here, for example. The first thing I'm going to cover is the hair and makeup. I don't want to say this is the most important part, but you would be amazed at how much just hair and makeup can change the vibe of an outfit. For instance, let's take a look at this outfit. Exactly the same, but with vintage hair and makeup. Now, I'm not saying you should start off with elaborate curls and an elaborate makeup style, but I do think, as stereotypical as it is, trying out a red lip or cat eye can help, at least to kind of test the waters and see how comfortable you are with wearing vintage makeup. And as far as the hair, without going into in-depth curls, you can try a 50s ponytail, you can try a couple different barrel rolls or victory rolls. Something simple that still gives off that vintage vibe. And obviously when you feel more comfortable with that, you can take on doing different curls and pin curls and foam rollers and pillow rollers, all of which I have tutorials on. No, but there are also tons of other great tutorials online that are super helpful and definitely helped me. Now, the reason I don't want to say this is the most important part is because it's a combination. I do think that vintage hair and makeup definitely helps, especially when you're like me and like to take modern clothes and kind of itchy. Hold on. And kind of like to give the illusion that it's vintage when it's not actually. The hair and makeup can definitely sell that. But a lot of times, if your outfit is very vintage already, you can get away with pretty much whatever hair and makeup and it'll still look very vintage. And there are no rules.
There's no rules! Let's just start back on. There's one rule!
No one is saying that you have to do vintage hair and makeup to wear vintage style. I'm just talking in general here and trying to make examples, so you do you. Next up, I want to talk about tops and blouses. This part I think is probably the easiest to schmooze as far as buying modern and passing it off as vintage. I actually don't have that many legitimately vintage tops. because I think a lot of the times it's much easier and cheaper to buy a modern sweater or collared shirt or blouse and pass it off as vintage. How many times have I said that in this one video already? You get it. What I would recommend doing is going to your local Salvation Army or thrift store. I know some countries don't have those readily accessible as the US does, but just bear with me. Even your modern stores like Target or pretty much any clothing store will have collared shirts, sweaters, cardigans, some flowy blouses, peasant tops maybe. Those are all in my wheelhouse of turning them into vintage, and it's a lot cheaper. Now, all that being said, if you do actually want to... What are you crying about? Kids. If you actually did want to take the vintage route or vintage reproduction, the first place I would start personally is Etsy. Now, I will have a video dedicated to how to use Etsy to find vintage very soon, but here's a little overview. It's all about the keywords. So if I was searching for a specific blouse, I would probably type 1940s blouse or 1950s blouse. And what I like to do, which you don't necessarily have to do, is set the max price to something that I'm comfortable with, because I am a cheapskate. Whew, I'm talking fast. Like an auctioneer.
And you're gonna go to Etsy and you're gonna type in 1940 blouse and 1950s blouse and you're gonna narrow the price down to 50 because you're a cheapskate and you don't want to spend a lot of money going once, going twice. Sold.
eBay is pretty much the same thing. I don't use eBay all that much because I'm very impatient and I don't like to bid for things. I want that instant gratification of buying something. The other options are vintage reproduction like Collective, and Lindy Bop is great for beginners who don't want to spend a lot of money. I will go over those more in depth when we talk about skirts and dresses. Next up, we're going to talk about skirts and trousers. So skirts and or trousers, I think, are very transformative when it comes to vintage style. They are such a good staple piece to have because you can take pretty much any shirt and add a vintage skirt and boom, the outfit becomes super vintage very quickly. Now for me, skirts are a little bit harder to find in thrift stores. So what I like to do is go on Etsy again and type in 1950s skirt or circle skirt or 1940s skirt, or a lot of times I am being very specific and I'll search for wool skirt or forest green skirt or something like that. Now that's not to say you can't find skirts in thrift stores. I have definitely found a fair share in thrift stores that are 80s, 90s, 2000s, but kind of have that vintage vibe and you can kind of schmooze it. Next up, shoes. Now, shoes are kind of where I struggle most because I got big old feet. Check out them slippers. But I do have a video about my favorite shoes. Of course, I'll link that if it's of any use. To play it safe, especially in the beginning, and you don't want to spend money on actual vintage shoes, keep an eye out for Oxfords or ballet flats or lace-up boots, because pretty much all of those can go with vintage outfits. So next up, I want to talk about dresses. So a lot of times an instant way to get vintage style is obviously a vintage dress. Now for me, when I first started out, I started out with vintage reproduction dresses. It's a good way to test out if you're comfortable with the style in itself and not having to kind of care for the delicate vintage dresses. I started off with Collective. This is from Collective. And my first vintage reproduction dress was this gray one. I remember putting it on and feeling so cool. So I definitely suggest checking that out. Also Lindy Bop, they have a lot more affordable dresses, so that's great for beginners if you just want to try out a dress or two and see how it feels. When you're ready to move to actual vintage dresses, I go on Etsy and I'll search 1940s dress or 1950s dress or 1950s green dress or 1940s velvet dress. Keywords are definitely your best friend when it comes to that, and also setting the max price because those dresses can get pricey. This whole thing is about your comfort level and how you feel. I know a lot of people are worried about how others will view them or react to them. While that is an intimidating factor and definitely something that I was a little wary of too, it's not about them. It's about how you feel. So I definitely understand being a little bit nervous. But like I said, start small. You can try doing your hair vintage sometimes and still wear modern clothes, or vice versa. You can start wearing a little bit more vintage attire and just see how you feel. I think it's really exciting to see that your personal style will start evolving even more. For instance, I started off very bright colors, stereotypical 1950s, and I've kind of evolved into more earth tone 1940s Hobbit. So everyone's personal style leads them somewhere else. Do what makes you happy, and that's it. So I'm gonna leave off this video with a little bit of a challenge for you. If you are interested in vintage style and you don't know where to start, I challenge you to go find a collared shirt or a blouse or a sweater that can pass as vintage or looks vintagey to you. Try it with a skirt or trousers. It can be a vintage skirt, it can be just a skirt that you think looks vintage. Maybe throw in some red lipstick or whatever you want. Do your hair if you want. Just see how you feel, and if it's something that makes you feel happy, then maybe it's something that you can pursue. Again, I never want this to be preachy. You don't have to. Am I spitting everywhere? Good God. Okay, I think that's it. Wow, that was more talking than I do in a month. But I hope that you guys found it helpful. I know a lot of you already do dress in vintage, so the main point of this is just don't get discouraged. Don't compare yourself to other people. You are your own person and with your own style evolution. I'm proud of you no matter what. Aww. And if you ever want to tag me in your photos, here's my Instagram handle. I love to see outfits that people put together and want advice on or anything like that. Again, I'm no expert, but I'm always there for a compliment if you want one. That is it. I'm gonna rest my speaking box for the rest of the year. I love you all so very much, whether you're new or old to this channel, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!
Come here, baby. Oh.
Thumbnail. I got punched in the face by my dog. Got a new lens? Look at me looking all HD. Oh, shit.
Grab this computer memory. Put it in my computer. I won't come out again.
Whenever I film, I make Nick go in the other room and close the door so he can't hear me. How do I start dressing vintage? Let me clear my throat. This lens gets every little detail, doesn't it? Wonderful. The rest of the options like eBay and vintage. So if you're looking, I'm gathering my thoughts face. I forgot what I was saying, and now my train of thought is all effed up. Oh, that mailman! How dare he deliver the mail? There's a lot of talking.
Nice place of KB with K badges, K beans and K rough.